Texas Math Mundo audience. Today we're in store for a slightly different kind of video. In the house, we have Dr. Audrey Amrein-Beardsley. She'll be talking about value-added models. Value-added models has pervaded the educational policy landscape for many, many years now, and it's very, very dangerous. It has many, many repercussions for teachers, and it's something to be truly informed about. So Dr. Amrein-Beardsley will be talking about that. It's a true treat for the channel. Let me take a quick moment and ask that if you enjoy this content, that you please hit the subscription button and the notification bell, that you leave a comment below, and you smash that like button. Help me spread this channel to as many people as possible. Dr. Audrey Amrein-Beardsley in the house today talking about value-added models. Right ahead. My name is Alcantar, and this is Texas Math Mundo. Texas Math Mundo audience, are we in store for a treat today? In the house is Dr. Audrey Amrein-Beardsley, Ph.D. It's my pleasure to introduce her. She's a professor in the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University. She received her Ph.D. from Arizona State University, specializing in educational policy and research evaluation methods. Dr. Amrein-Beardsley is widely recognized as a top education scholar in the nation, with her research being highlighted in many esteemed news outlets, including NPR, the New York Times, USA Today, the Washington Post, Education Week, the Huffington Post, the Economist, local news outlets like the Boston Globe, Houston Chronicle, Arizona Republic, and television media such as PBS, Public Broadcasting Service, and HBO's Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. Dr. Amrein-Beardsley research interests include educational policies, measurement and measurement-based systems, research methods, and more specifically, educational policies and systems based upon high-stakes tests and value-added models. She is the author of over 100 peer and editorially reviewed journal articles and 2 academic books. She has served as an expert witness on behalf of many educators across the states and districts in lawsuits pertaining to the misuse of students' large-scale standardized test scores. I want to extend a heartfelt welcome to Dr. Amrein-Beardsley. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to this.
Awesome. First, how are you doing? What's keeping you busy nowadays?
Oh, good. Actually, it's summer break, so I am taking a little bit of a break from all the research and teaching that I'm doing. But yeah, moving forward in terms of still looking at high stakes testing and testing policies because they're still all around.
Yes, and that's the purpose of this video because it amazes me that they're still around. So here's the deal. Let's frame the discussion. My opening question is, can math accurately isolate the teacher effect and measure teacher effectiveness? Can the math accurately put a number on a teacher that measures their effectiveness?
Okay, so here's the deal. So these policies that we're talking about, they're based on tests, and we call them high stakes tests when there are consequential decisions that are attached to the test scores, right? And so these are considered, especially by policymakers and many people in the public, to be the most objective measures that we have to measure things like student learning and achievement, and also to measure teachers' impacts on student learning and achievement. And the reason they're considered to be so objective is because they are based on mathematics, right? And so when the students take a test score, the computer or whatever algorithm spit out a number, and that's the student's performance. And then when those numbers are aggregated or put together and looked at over time in terms of how a student or a group of students might grow over time or decline over time in their academic achievement, then that can be, at least theoretically, causally attributed to the teacher and the teacher's effects. And so there are what we call many heroic assumptions in all of that theoretical logic that I just explained. And so this is a quintessential exercise in theory to practice, and that's a big area of research in terms of what we theoretically think is going to happen and what actually happens in practice. And so when we look back to the mathematical portions of these tests, indeed they do spit out mathematical numbers, and you can manipulate those numbers into percentiles and rankings, and they're very, very valuable for reductionistic purposes and hierarchical ranking of the best schools and the worst schools. And the policies that are based on these tests can really go kind of crazy on these measures as the best measures that we have. But at the end of the day, what people don't understand is that these tests are highly constructed. And so when you look at the innards of the test, we have to remember that people created these tests, and the extent to which the mathematics that come out of these tests, and we have to question the extent to which what comes out of these tests is actually true. Is it perhaps one indicator of something as based on the mathematics? For sure. But the ways in which the tests are constructed, the ways in which the items are included or removed, the ways in which typical test developers most often need their tests to fit normal distributions. And by doing that, there's many, many constructed exercises where it's very, very subjective in the way that by which these items are included and removed from the test. And so at the end of the day, what you get is really a not great representative sample of typically about 40 to 50 items that are supposed to measure 9 months of schooling in every subject area that's tested. And so when we even think about the representation and what that number means, we have to say, okay, that number at 86, whatever that might mean, does that represent what this student has learned throughout that 9 months in, let's just say, ninth grade algebra 1, algebra 2? And we have to think, does that number also represent the teacher? And did the teacher actually impact a demonstrable or observable impact on 50 items over a 9-month period of time from the pre-test occasion to the post-test occasion? And so once you put those assumptions into check, the theory unravels. And so we really, even though people don't understand that and they do believe that mathematics don't lie, this endeavor, these tests are highly constructed with many biases and many factors and many technical issues in play. One issue I'll just mention, which is another one, is these tests have never been validated to measure teacher impacts at all. They're only measured for student learning. But another one is that these tests were never created or validated to measure growth over time. But because they're there and they're convenient and they're already paid for by taxpayer funds, what are fancy statisticians, but typically econometricians, and there's a difference there. What they've done is just said, well, we can just measure growth over time, even though they've never been equated, which means it's kind of complicated, but they've never been matched to be able to measure, for example, fourth grade learning to fifth grade learning to sixth grade learning. So the assumption is that these tests are on this linear slope and that you can measure this growth upward, but they're really all over the place because they've never been developed to be vertically equated over time. And so, again, I said before, there are a lot of heroic assumptions that go into this, but typical people who don't do research or investigate this even in the slightest, do some reading about it, they just believe that what was theorized and also put into policy is what makes sense.
Definitely want to explore its use in policy and many, many consequences of this. But let's get on with the definition. What is a value-added model?
Sure. So So the value added model is essentially looking at an aggregate level of students' test scores. And so that's typically aggregated at the teacher level, although students' test scores can also be aggregated at the school level and aggregated at the district level. So we can look at value added at the teacher level, school level, and district level based on how we aggregate the data or how we put the data together. But typically, what's most often used is the teacher level value added. And so what happens is, for example, if I'm a fifth grade teacher, my students, the year before they come to me, they were in fourth grade. And so at the end of their fourth grade year, they take a test, and they are in different classrooms at this point. They take a test, and when they enter my classroom as their new fifth grade teacher, those scores from wherever they were prior, they are aggregated at my level, and that's considered my pre-test occasion. Let's just call that. Now, there's a lot of heroic assumptions in there as well, because usually the spring tests are given in April of the year prior, and students usually have May and some of June perhaps to finish out the school year with that teacher. And then there's a lot of research on what we call summer learning decay and growth. And so those are really highly tied to socioeconomic status as well. So students who have opportunities to travel over the summer, they show more academic growth. Students who don't have opportunities and might not have resources, whatever, they show significant levels of decline. So nonetheless, because those students left that fourth grade teacher, these whatever happened after that pretest in the fourth grade teacher's classroom is now going to be causally attributed to my efforts, right? But just to be clear, so that includes the summer months. Now they enter my fifth grade classroom. Now I'm on call to teach them as best I can until my fifth grade April or May, whenever the test might be distributed. And so then what the value added indicator actually is an algorithmic indicator, and it's looking at those fourth grade scores, how those students, how they performed in fourth grade, but also how they performed in third grade and second grade. So typically 3 years prior to entering my classroom, and what their predicted levels of growth are. That predicted levels of growth, there's an average taken of that. Essentially, this is pretty basic. I'm simplifying
Sure,
it
sure.
also for your audience. But that predicted level of growth is my target. I don't know what that target is. And even if I did know it, I probably wouldn't know what to do with it. But I've got this target that's out there. And if I exceed that target that was predicted for me and my aggregated students, then I'm considered a value added teacher. If I do not meet that target, then I'm not considered a value added teacher. There's no antonym to value added. It's not like value detracted, but essentially I'm a negative growth teacher. And those are the teachers who, by policy, depending on the state, are typically the ones who are most eligible, let's say, for the negative consequences that are attached to value added model scores. And that can be anything from increased professional development that might be mandated. It can be the revoking of a teacher tenure if teacher tenure has already been awarded. It can mean no merit pay. It can mean no raise. And in the worst case scenarios, it can also mean teacher termination.
Yeah, I was at HISD when they actually passed a resolution that allowed for teacher termination based on student test scores. So that's one of the reasons I have you here, because it's dear to my heart, this cause. So do the value-added models measure teacher effectiveness reliably, accurately?
No. Okay, so no. So here's, and you use the word reliably, and so that's a really important term for everyone to understand. So reliable, like a synonym for reliable, is consistent, right? And so reliable is actually a technical term. It goes along with something called validity. And so, but reliability is that in itself is quantifiable. So we can use numbers to assess reliability. And what we're looking at is that the scores stay consistent over time. And so I'm back to my fifth grade self. And if I'm a fifth grade teacher and I've been a fifth grade teacher for 10 years, then you should expect, at least for the last 3, 4, 5 years, that my scores are pretty consistent. if indeed I am, and if let's just say I'm an effective teacher, I should be considered based on my students' aggregated test scores and their growth over time. I should be considered an effective teacher consistently over time. And can I be considered highly effective, and then highly effective, and effective? Sure, that makes sense. But what we're seeing, and that's fine with the reliability, because there's these coefficients that we calculate that would actually measure what this, I would call that slight lack of consistency, what that actually means in a quantifiable term. But what we see, and this is across all the models I've ever examined, across all the states, and across all the states in which I've been involved in lawsuits, reliability is the number one issue that is impacting the extent to which these value added models work, again, as theorized. And so, what we're seeing in practice, as per the research that we're doing, is that you can be, or I'm the fifth grade teacher and I could be highly effective one year and then I can drop to highly ineffective the next year. And then the next year I can be effective. And then the next year I can be ineffective. And then I'm back to highly ineffective or highly effective, whatever that might be. So the permutations and combinations are all over the place for these teachers. And so we see it in the research. So the reliability coefficients that we're coming up with are like really, really low, which means the consistencies are just like this. We're also doing more recent research at the school level. And we think because we have larger data we have more test scores when we aggregate at the school level, we might see increased reliability. We're seeing the same levels of reliability where a school can be high value added to low value added to average to low value added to high value. So it's just all over the place. And so in psychometrics, one of the rules is unless you have to have reliability before you can move towards the next psychometric term, which is called validity. But validity is just essentially the truth in the test score or the truth in the output that we're looking. Like this score means she is a high value added teacher. So if you have inconsistency like this, you can't even move to making a judgment about the teacher in terms of there's nothing consistent. It's kind of like using a temperature, that says you're 104 and 96 and 98 and then 102. You're going to throw that measurement tool out because it's broken, right?
Yes.
You're going to, yeah. So that's the same thing here. If it's unreliable and inconsistent, we can't move towards making valid inferences in this case about teachers.
Doctor, it happened to me. One year I got a $10,000 bonus. The next year I'm in the red. And I'm like the same guy, the same passion, the same heart. And one year I'm being, lauded as such a great teacher. The other year I'm being looked with a raised eyebrow. It's just really frustrating from a teacher standpoint to be subjected to that kind of measurement. Be honest with you.
Yeah. There are so many stories. So I said that we see it in the research, and I talk about these things called coefficients. It's all fancy, but we have so many anecdotes from teachers like you and teachers from all these districts, and that's exactly what they say. They're like, one year I'm rewarded, $5,000, and the next year I get kicked in the butt. And they're like, I'm not doing anything differently. What is happening with this? And then the penalties and the bonuses that come along with this, it's just all over the place. They feel like it's random themselves. Yeah.
There's all kinds of sinister consequences, let me tell you. But before we do that, how widespread are educational policies that employ value-added models?
Okay, so that's a good question. So value-added models came into play around 2007, 2008. Long and short, No Child Left Behind. It was passed in 2002, 2001, 2002. That required all states to have tests in math and reading language arts, grades 3 through 8, and then once in high school. And then at that time, and people who have been around for a while will remember that states were all required to do something called adequate yearly progress. And that was looking at test scores over time, but not in a value added way. But the adequate AYP was what it was called. It was not working. And states recognized that the way that states were supposed to measure and report AYP was not functioning. Enter a set of econometricians, which I mentioned them before. It's a different discipline, different realities. They're more likely to pick up test scores for what they're theoretically worth versus like looking at the innards to understand again how socially constructed that they really are, that the mathematics isn't just completely 100% objective, right? So they entered the federal government, the lobbyists of these companies and so forth, and they convinced the feds under President Obama's administration to move away from adequate yearly progress into value-added models. Value-added models are sometimes called growth models, and I won't go into that. Value-added models are typically a little bit more sophisticated, but they both kind of are the same thing. And so then with Race to the Top, which is under former President Barack Obama's administration, all states were not mandated to adopt value-added models, but they were highly incentivized with buku millions and millions of dollars in funds that the states desperately need because the states rely heavily on federal funds to run their educational programs for the states. And so pretty much all states applied for Race to the Top funds, and there was a first wave and second wave and so forth, and pretty much the states who were awarded the funds, especially during the first and second round, were states that had already had some kind of value added model at least in process, and also were attaching serious consequences to those, right? So they were really putting the teeth into their educational policies, like we are finally going to hold teachers accountable for this another assumption for what they're not doing, or not caring about students learning, or whatever these assumptions that were being thrown around. Also with the publication of something called the widget effect report, which is a big report that also informed this change. So value added models were high stakes based. The states adopted these policies, they implemented the policies, and then around 2014, so we're about 2, 3, 4 years into this, a lot of these lawsuits start to pop up, and most of them are from teachers on behalf of teachers. So teachers as the plaintiffs. Many of the lawsuits were funded by either the AFT, so the American Federation of Teachers, or the I forget, the American Evaluation Association, Educators Association, I think is the other big union. Anyways, so once these lawsuits started to play out, and I was involved in, I think most, if not all of those lawsuits as the expert witness, we won pretty much all of them. And so I think, so the only ones we didn't win, and this is just important, it's interesting, we didn't win the one in Tennessee, which is where the value added model was first kind of constructed. And that's the company, the SAS Incorporated bought the value added model from the developer in Tennessee and moved it to North Carolina. And that's where it became this big conglomerate corporate proprietary system. So that they were the lobbyists that were really involved. They were at least one set of lobbyists. So in Tennessee, in that lawsuit, the judge sided with the plaintiffs in terms of all these things that we know from the research, like reliability as one example. And the judge essentially said, the research does not support the uses of these value-added models in the ways that they're being used. However, it was a rational basis test that we had to pass. And he's like, at the end of the day, it's still a rational endeavor to try to measure the impacts that teachers have on their students using test scores, even though we know that this is not working, is still rational. So we lost that one, but even the lawyers on the defense side were like, this is crazy that our state is doing this and other states are doing this, because they understood by the end of the trial how the research just doesn't support it. But they also were like, well, we still win because it's the rational basis test. And the same thing happened in Florida. But to answer your question, most states now no longer, the feds don't require anymore after the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is in 2016. But a lot of states still invested heavily in it because of Race to the Top. And so it was kind of hard for many of them to just go, okay, we got the models developed and we hired people and we have human resources involved. And so a lot of states still continued down that path. But I will say that most states have taken a couple steps back in terms of the consequences. And I think that's because of the lawsuits. They realize that they cannot terminate teachers when the scores are not justifiable and not defensible in a court.
Rational, but not reliable. So, good. So the question is, so even at the highest tiers of education policymaking, the Department of Education, why did they ignore the research? Why was the research being ignored? And I'm telling you right now, Texas is utilizing a little bit of VAMS, and they got something called a Texas incentive allotment to do bonuses towards teachers. I mean, I guess you want to give bonuses randomly, that might be fine, but the danger is once a number gets put on a teacher, he becomes defined by that number. It's very sinister, in fact. But yeah, why are these education policymakers at the highest tiers of our bureaucracies ignoring the research?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think there is research out there that they can pull for sure. And I have always said that if you did a fair assessment of the research, you would find 90% of the research that's pretty much providing evidence against using value added models in these ways. But there is 10% of the research that you can certainly non randomly select for your own political means and purposes, in terms of especially policymakers who are running for office or whatever that might be, because these are pillars of educational reform. And so holding students accountable or holding teachers accountable for student learning using student test scores, which are objective based on mathematics, that sells. And that sells, and we have research on this as well, in relatively more conservative states like Texas, like Arizona. The Sun Belt states are the states that often have these types of policies. And so these are also less expensive educational reform measures versus things that we know work from the research, like reducing class sizes. Like, we have decades of research in terms of the extent to which reducing class sizes actually has a positive impact on student learning and achievement, but that's expensive. And so the states who typically take up those types of reform measures are typically states that pay their teachers higher than the national average. They're typically states that have fewer English language learners, fewer students from or racially marginalized communities. Typically, students are states with fewer students from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So there's a lot of intercorrelations here. And so the policymakers, again, in these states like the Sun Belt states and other states like Ohio and Indiana and Tennessee, they're the ones that knowing the demographics of the state, we can almost predict whether they have a strong value model or a strong test-based accountability model, even based on the demographics, including the political demographics of the state. And so it is highly politically driven. It's economically, like, you think about it, 2002, all the states were required to have these tests and pay for the tests, right? So if their tests are already there, why wouldn't we pick them up? Because we've already paid for them, and use them for educational reform purposes versus looking into, again, things like class size reduction or increased teacher pay or increased teacher retention, those types of things.
So it's an easy fix that really isn't an easy fix.
Oh, no, it's complicated.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
Wow, wow. So in these courtroom battles, what were the plaintiffs claiming?
Oh, gosh. So the plaintiffs were typically teacher plaintiffs. Let's see, you name it. Okay, so in the New Mexico case was a huge case, and that one, there were multiple teacher plaintiffs who, for example, were teaching subjects, and these were primarily high school teachers. The plaintiffs were a lot of teachers, but the high school teachers were plaintiffs because they were teaching things like calculus, and the algebra, or the high school graduation exam that went up to algebra 3, 4, and geometry was being used to evaluate their value added as effective teachers. And so they're like, we teach calculus. We don't, I mean, there's algebra involved in calculus, but so that's another validity issue. And that's a content validity issue where the content that they're teaching is not mapping onto the content that's being tested. And then in the state of New Mexico, at least, that tested content was being used against the teachers to say, you're not a very effective teacher because you didn't teach algebra 3, 4, and geometry very well at the 10th grade, right? So there was a major disconnect, and that was one of the biggest cases, one of the biggest issues in New Mexico. Another was in Houston, which is right. So Houston was probably one of the most significant lawsuits that we had. There, because they were using the model that I identified before that's owned by SAS Incorporated, which is an international business software analytics corporation.
EVOS.
Look, yeah, EVAS, it's called the Education Value Added Assessment System. That was being used in Houston, but because it's proprietary, they do not release their algorithmic codes. They hold a lot of things as proprietary to the point, and this is overly simplifying things, but essentially Houston was sending off their data to SAS Incorporated in North Carolina, and then SAS would send it back and say, here are your teacher scores. And so what ended up being the biggest issue in the Houston case is that even the expert witnesses who were involved. So I was one, and then a professor by the name of Jesse Rothstein, who's an econometrician at UC Berkeley. He was involved, and he was the one that was actually granted secret access to look at the algorithms in the code and perhaps to even replicate. You should be, if especially if taxpayer funds are being used on this, then the state should have the right to replicate to make sure that SAS got it right. I mean, SAS is under contract, but there is something to be said about verification processes, right? But because the EVAS is so closed, it's this black box model, even this Professor Rothstein had a very difficult time with replicating or even getting access to anything. Essentially, he was allowed to use a pencil and a piece of paper to do his work, right? Because there was whatever. So that's a whole other story. But the point is with his testimony and with my testimony, the judge basically ruled that because we as expert witnesses couldn't, and states couldn't even replicate what was happening to these teachers in Houston, if you apply even more, like if you multiply that out, then the teachers have no way in heck to figure out why did I get a score of, average. And if they didn't have access to their own records, even the extent to which whether the students that were used, the students' test scores that were used to evaluate me as a teacher, even if they were accurate, they didn't have access to any of that information. This stuff was just happening completely exclusive of them and their input and their knowledge and their verification or anything. So that was ruled as a violation of their 14th Amendment rights. And so that was a game changer in Houston, which set precedent for all these other lawsuits because the teachers did not have access enough to the data in order to understand the data, also to defend themselves as per what the 14th Amendment requires or mandates. And so that was another big one. So those are probably the two, but the reliability issue was definitely an issue across where the teachers were complaining about up and down. There were a lot of cases where, for example, teachers of the year would get ranked or perhaps put in the newspaper. The public newspaper is one of the worst teachers in the city of
Oh,
Dallas or
oh
whatever
my
it might be. I
God.
mean, there were a lot of LA had a
Public
searchable,
shaming.
yeah, public shaming. So the Los Angeles Times had you could search a teacher by name and it would tell the teacher's value added scores. And so then they released the worst teachers in LA County. And,
A
some
score
of,
that may not have been even
yeah,
remotely reflective of their ability.
right. So
Oh,
some of those teachers, and so in the lawsuits, and that happened a lot in New York, and there was a big lawsuit in New York about this too. But some of these teachers were like, I just was awarded the teacher of the year, so there's a validity indicator where if you have these mathematical scores saying the worst teacher, and then you've got the supervisors and the community or the community of professionals who are saying teacher of the year, you've got this disconnect that you cannot just, rationalize away. And so that was an issue. And then this New York case, which was a fascinating issue. This was actually an N of one case. So there was one teacher involved, and she was a national board certified teacher. So I think you know what that is, but that's basically like a national board certified doctor, but in the teacher venue. A very, very rigorous process to prove to this board that you're one of the best teachers in the country and you get awarded the national board certification. Well, she was national board certified and she was in the New York Times, I believe it was, or whatever New York newspaper released the searchable engine. And so she was listed as one of the worst teachers in the New York public city schools. I forget the actual details at this point, but she happened to be married to a lawyer. He basically whatever he specialized in then, he started specializing in tests. And he put together, I think there were 6 expert witnesses on her behalf on that one. And essentially, what had happened is that she was teaching gifted students only. And so, with gifted students, and there's this statistical term, which we call it the ceiling effect, this gifted students, again, simplifying this, but the gifted students were expected to achieve more than the scale of the test score was even maxed out at. So it was impossible for her to even reach, or her students to even reach, a score that was not even existent on the test. And so what happened is that she was determined as one of the worst teachers in the country. I'm sorry, one of the worst teachers in New York, because she was teaching only gifted students. So she won that case, and that was, precedent setting and so forth. I mean, there's other cases too. And there was a big one in Florida, wrongful termination. That was another one teacher. We won that one. And so, yeah, so back to the initial thing, there's 90% of the research that says these are the reasons why these things don't work. The other 10%, those people who write the other 10% are usually on the defense side of these cases. And again, unless it's the rational basis test like it was in Tennessee and Florida, we've won all the cases based on the research that we have.
Wow. So litigation, you say that there's been a little bit of a step back from value-added models. So litigation has provided some sort of justice for teachers.
Yeah, I like to believe that, and I don't want to be egocentric about that, but I'd like to think that I had something to do with that. In fact, at the time that this was all going on, I had a blog called Bamboozled. So value added model is the VAM acronym, and then bamboozled. That's what it was. I mean, it speaks for itself. And when ESSA was passed, so Every Student Succeeds Act was passed in 2016, I think it was like 60,000 followers. Which is pretty significant. And that it meant that this was a significant issue. Primarily following were teachers, but there were parents involved, or parent following, there were researchers who were following. And so essentially what I was writing at that time, it was so crazy. I was writing at least 5, if not 10 posts per week, highlighting personal interest stories, highlighting what's happening across the country in terms of like newspapers and news releases, lawsuits. And then also research reports that were coming out, because all of us were just generating so much research because this was such a hot topic. So I was summarizing all of those types of things. And so after ESSA was passed in 2016, it was a sharp decline. And so I think the lawsuits had something to do with that. I think, of course, ESSA, the passage of ESSA had a lot to do with that. But then also the states kind of retreating a little bit based on the consequences, because I think they didn't want to get themselves involved in lawsuits either. So I think that is what has caused the decline. Now, there's still your education reformers that are still primarily located in the states that we talked about before. They're, oversimplify very complex issues, and they typically do so using test-based reform. And so now the new kid on the block is school level value added, or district level value added. And so that's kind of where our research has gone now, to look at whether you can hold like principals accountable for a school that doesn't meet its target every year, or whatever that might mean.
Let me tell you, I visited your blog many times, Bamboozled.
Yeah.
And let me tell you something. It's such a sense of comfort. Let me applaud you, because I knew fairly well on the ground. You know how helpless a teacher feels? You know how utterly helpless a teacher feels when they're being evaluated on something that doesn't even remotely accurately measure their effectiveness at all. And then once that number gets put on you, people judge you by that number. You no longer, the teacher. You're the value-added negative guy, or you're the bonus guy. So going to your blog, let me tell you, it made an impact for me personally. For those of us who knew that the truth was being distorted out there, that we were just helpless peons in this game, and to see that the truth was, at least there was some website with a shining beacon of truth trying to say, look at me, this is what the research really says. So let me applaud you. Let me completely applaud you, just so you know that. So
thank you. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Let me tell you, that's the truth. And I want a resounding truth. So what was the impact, or was the impact of all these value-added models? It didn't improve teaching, did it? It didn't improve education, did it? If anything, it stopped teachers from trying to enter a field where they were going to be arbitrarily judged.
Yeah, no, you're right. If the unintended consequence of all of this, the number one unintended consequence would be the teacher shortage, because teachers are like, why would I enter a profession where I'm going to be treated like this? And in such under the thumb of such draconian measures where tests are the only thing that, they go in, and they should go into teaching in very idealistic but also realistic terms. Like, this is supposed to be inspiring and fun and changing the lives of children and all these things, and it's just not that way anymore. So the unintended consequence of all this, which is not just value added models, but it's really all high stakes test based accountability policies, whatever those might look like, it just doesn't work. So to your initial question, we have not seen, so the best test that we have for our nation is called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's called the NAEP. And so we look at these trends over time, and we also do this like from a policy analysis perspective. And so you're expecting, if some kind of policy like this was actually to work, you would expect the trends, they might be going, maybe we are just a little bit, we inch up just a little bit every year. So a little bit of an incline, but if this policy really was supposed to work, we would see an increase, like a significant increase in terms of when the policy hits or a year after the policy hits, and all we see is this. And we've only seen this for years. And that is regardless of No Child Left Behind, because No Child Left Behind was holding students accountable for their test scores. And so even though VAMS moved on to teachers and now we're moving on to schools, it did start as the unit of analysis with students. And we have to make sure they pass a third grade test before they move to fourth grade, because they need to take their learning more seriously. And they can't graduate high school unless they pass a high school graduation exam. So all of that was student focused, but the National Assessment of Educational Progress, all we saw were trends like this, right? And that's happened. Honestly, and that's happened ever since the first high stakes test that was ever implemented was in the state of Florida. Not surprising, it's part of the Sun Belt, and that was in 1979. And we have literally seen no positive effects from 1979 to today. And so we're looking at, do the math on that, over 40 years now of just this, this little bit of incline, but no real policy spikes that the policymakers advertise their policies for to the voting public, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's repeating some people, most people say that Einstein said this, but it's repeating the same behavior over and over again, the definition of insanity, and expecting to have different results. Well, that's exactly what we've been doing with test-based accountability. It just does not, there's no proof that it works. And I have to also say that it's often lauded for a way to decrease the achievement gap. And usually the achievement gap is defined as the achievement levels of typically white and Asian American students. And then in the lower side of this trend line are typically students from racially marginalized backgrounds, which include Latinx children, African American children, and Native American children, especially in states that have high, like Arizona has a high Native American population. And so often theorize that these policies will help decrease this achievement gap and increase equity, right? And we have the same evidence where it's just like this. So they're not improving. Those are the two positive consequences that are supposed to come from test-based accountability. And we literally have no evidence that either of those positive consequences have come about. However, we have a lot of evidence about the unintended consequences that have come about, like the teacher shortage, and a pretty direct relationship between these types of things and teachers not entering or exiting the field.
So let me tell you, some of the administrators and board members were defending the VAMs and saying, oh, well, that's only one of several measures. But here's the really sinister thing. Appraisers, those who judge a teacher's job performance, were letting that score influence them. They were not independent. There was no independence here. That they would hedge their bets because they were afraid of being accused of giving a good score to a teacher who will eventually have a negative value-added model number associated to them. So it was so sinister. What got me scared today, what scares me in today's environment, is that in HISD, it started off with just bonuses. At first, they were just handing out bonuses based on this number. And then the other edge of the sword came about, and then they made it to where they could actually fire you. Right now in my district in Texas, they get a Texas incentive allotment where you can get extra money right now. So it's all just dishing out some money. It's awards. But the other side of the sword is never far away. So I'm afraid it's going to go the way of HISD, and then as soon as nobody's looking, all of a sudden, punitive consequences for a negative value-added model score on you.
Well, if they do that, then make sure to reach out or have those teachers reach out, because if they don't have the research evidence or the empirical evidence to warrant such a decision, then they will be ripe for another lawsuit, via which or during which all that evidence will be examined and the data from the district will be examined, and we'll look at things like reliability and validity and all of the indicators that are supposed to be in place. And not just promise, not just theoretical, like this is the actual empirical data that would need to be examined. But to your earlier point, and this is an important point, that the administrators were, using the value added indicators to bias their own assessments of teacher, right? This happened across the country too. And this was another issue with these lawsuits. And Tennessee, the one that we lost because of the rational basis test, the state of Tennessee, the legislature actually passed a policy for the state that if the principal or the observer who's doing the observation of the teachers, if that observer was too far away, and too far was defined by like two categories, too far away from the value added indicator, then the principal got in trouble. And so they put that into policy. So the consequence of that is that, okay, first of all, while you say multiple measures matter, what you're doing is you're basically making the value added indicator count for 100% of everything.
Yes.
And yeah, in some states, in the state of New York, it said if the observational indicator was too far off away from the value added indicator, the value added indicator counts for 100%. So there were actually policies at the time that were saying this is what we're going to do. So of course, then the administrators are like, now it's a high stakes consequence for me. So I am going to get in trouble. So of course they start, and I wrote an article about this with a bunch of examples from the court cases. And I called it, basically it's artificial conflation. And so you're conflating these two numbers, and you're actually conflating them, but you're really conflating the observational one more to meet this one, right? Because this is the one, the objective one that's based on mathematics around which the whole universe of truth exists. And so, right, but that throws the whole enterprise into the toilet, because you're like, why are we even taking other measures at this point if
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, right. It just has no authority or respect in terms of what she or he may be doing in terms of the observations. So,
but what kills me is how widespread these policies have been. How did everybody just decide to ignore the research? How widespread all these and upper tiers of education policy making, and how it just spread as if it were truth, And it really killed me that something like that could happen at this day and age, when you figure people are enlightened and informed by the research. And said, oh my God. So give me an analysis. Right now in the present educational policy setting and in the future, what's the present state of VAMS, and what do you expect the future of value-added models to be in the educational policy making?
So, okay. So the present is that, again, after the passage of the Every Student Succeeds Act, the states have retreated. However, there are still states and there are still districts within states like Houston, and many districts in Florida, because Florida is still going strong with this. So there are still districts primarily who are going really strong, full forward. Now, I have not heard of any terminations. At least I've heard of no terminations where the teacher or teachers are going to fight back in the last probably 4 years. The last one was a case in Florida, and that teacher was that was just that's just an interesting article read in and of itself, to see all the issues that came up with this teacher that were unprecedented before in terms of what we even knew from the research, and what the state of Florida was convincing basically this, or incentivizing this district to do. So is it going to be around forever? I think so, because I think that most people agree that it is better to at least attempt to measure growth versus one snapshot in time. But the measures are just not able enough to do that, especially if you're going to tie any kind of consequence to the indicator. Now, if you were going to be reasonable and you were to respect the research and you were to respect and understand the primarily limitations and perhaps a couple strengths of doing this analysis of growth over time versus these snapshots one piece at a time, if you were reasonable and rational about that, then they might have some value in terms of saying, hey, our school, what happened this year, and have a conversation about that, and maybe say, you know what, this whole, whatever, this new program, this new curriculum, have conversations. But what doesn't happen nearly enough is that humans or professionals in this case, you get to have a voice and have conversations around these data, because having conversations around these data means that they're subjective again. And so the people who are really pro value added models really want to marginalize human voice and human judgment. They want to take that factor out of the objective equation. So I do think that they are going to stick around. And do I have faith that they're going to get better over time? No. Could they, if states invested, for example, in better tests that were more representative and that were vertically equated to actually measure growth over time? Perhaps that would be a step in the right direction. Are states willing to invest that time of money in terms of financial, but also human resources? Absolutely not. Might there be an anomaly out there, some district that's going to get it right? Perhaps. Like, I'd hate to be a naysayer and say it's impossible, but right now, I don't think it's likely.
Dr. Amrein-Beardsley for Education Secretary, if you ask me. Tell you, somebody who knows the research, somebody who knows the impact of these policies.
Thank you.
Seriously. So the thing is, I do appreciate, you've been a beacon of light. I do mean this sincerely, because from a guy who was in the HISD schools when all this was happening, so utterly frustrated, seeing the misery around me, and just people are like, what's happening here? And it was so sinister. It was so negative. A blight on the teaching profession. That's what it was. And so to have guys, researchers like you, screaming the truth, a beacon of light, it really, really, really helped.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely.
I appreciate that. That's, you all are the reasons I do the research that I do. I would not do research if I was preaching to people in an ivory tower. I think that we all as researchers have to be very pragmatic and applied in that which we do, and that's which we impact and stand up for. And so, yeah, I appreciate that very much so.
Well, I hope you continue to, because I am still scared of VAMs. I got PTSD on this VAM stuff at HISD, so I got this post-traumatic stress syndrome with that. So I hope you continue to be a beacon of light, a spreader of truth. Dr. Amrein-Beardsley, do you have any final words or parting thoughts as we conclude this interview?
Oh gosh. I think I would encourage policymakers to just be aware that we are repeating history over and over again, and we are not yielding the positive effects from this. And if a policymaker was even thinking about a high stakes test-based accountability policy or move, I would love that policymaker just to understand that one point. And so maybe whatever our teachers can to share out or get involved with their voices in terms of policy arenas, I think that would be really important. Other than that, I would just encourage teachers to do the best that they can in the constraints that significantly surround them and have exponentially surrounded them more, especially over the last 15-ish years. And so I hate to see people not wanting to enter the profession. I work with them on a daily basis in terms of people who are entering our college to become teachers. And they're like, why would we? And so I think that's a real scary state of affairs when our democracy depends on an educated citizenry to function. And so I just wish people still cared as much about that as I do.
Absolutely, absolutely. I continue to applaud you. I want to say a heartfelt thank you for all your work. I'm in Houston. If you're ever in this neck of the woods, man, ring me up. We can talk about this more. I do appreciate it. I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you so much. Yes, and definitely keep in touch from your end as well.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Farewell, farewell, Dr.
Okay.
Amrein-Beardsley.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.
Wow, what a fascinating discussion with Dr. Audrey Amrein-Beardsley. She truly enlightened us on the state of value-added models, the impact it's had on the educational landscape. Thank you very much, Dr. Amrein-Beardsley. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Let me take a quick moment and ask that if you enjoy this content, that you please hit the subscription button and the notification bell, that you leave a comment below, and that you smash that like button. Help me spread this joy, help me spread this beauty to as many people as possible. I have many wonderful things in store for this channel, and I truly appreciate your support. My name is Saul Gantu, and this is Texas Math Mundo. Farewell, farewell.